They had never flown before. Most had never even seen an airplane up close. Yet in just 6 months, these young Americans would transform from farm boys and city clerks into the world's most lethal fighter pilots, taking on Germany's battle-hardened aces in the skies over France. This is the extraordinary story of how America built its first generation of combat aviators from absolute scratch during World War I, turning raw recruits into deadly warriors in a time frame that seems impossible by today's standards. It's a tale of innovation, desperation, courage, and the birth of American air power. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, the nation faced an aviation crisis of staggering proportions. While European powers had been locked in aerial combat for nearly 3 years, perfecting tactics and building thousands of aircraft, America's aviation program was virtually non-existent. The entire U.S. military possessed fewer than 60 airplanes, most of them obsolete training models that would have been laughable in combat. There wasn't a single American-built aircraft suitable for frontline service. Even more alarming, the military had fewer than 200 trained pilots, and almost none had any combat experience whatsoever. The challenge was monumental. America needed to create, essentially overnight, an entire aviation industry, a comprehensive training system, and thousands of skilled pilots ready to face the most experienced fighter aces in the world. The Germans had pilots like the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, with 80 confirmed kills. The French had aces who had been dogfighting since 1914. Britain's Royal Flying Corps had developed sophisticated tactics through years of brutal aerial warfare. And America? America had enthusiasm, determination, and an urgent need to catch up before the war was lost. The solution would require unprecedented mobilization and innovation. The U.S. military, working with civilian aviation experts, designed an accelerated training program that condensed years of normal flight instruction into just 6 months. It was ambitious, risky, and absolutely necessary. Young men from every corner of America would be recruited, tested, and pushed to their absolute limits. Many would wash out. Some would die in training. But those who made it through would form the backbone of American air power for decades to come. Let's start at the beginning with ground school. Before these young recruits ever touched an airplane, they needed to understand the theory of flight, navigation, meteorology, aircraft engines, weapons systems, and military tactics. The Army established primary ground schools at 8 universities across the country, including Princeton, MIT, Cornell, and the University of California. These weren't casual courses. The curriculum was intense, cramming what would normally take years into just 8 to 12 weeks of instruction. The candidates arrived from all walks of life. There were college students who put their degrees on hold, mechanics who understood engines, farm boys who had never been more than 20 miles from home, and city dwellers who had barely seen open sky. What united them was a burning desire to fly and serve their country. The selection process was rigorous. Candidates had to be between 18 and 30 years old, unmarried, and pass strict physical examinations. Their reflexes were tested, their vision had to be perfect, and their mental acuity was evaluated through a series of challenging tests. Ground school days began before dawn, and often stretched past midnight. The students studied aerodynamics, learning how airfoils generated lift, how control surfaces affected flight, and the principles that kept an aircraft aloft. They memorized every component of the engines they would soon be trusting with their lives, understanding pistons, magnetos, carburetors, and fuel systems in intricate detail. Weather patterns became their obsession because a pilot who couldn't read the sky was a dead pilot. They learned to identify cloud formations, predict wind patterns, and understand how temperature and pressure affected aircraft performance. Navigation was another critical subject. Without the sophisticated instruments we take for granted today, these pilots would navigate by dead reckoning, compass headings, and visual landmarks. They studied maps until they could visualize terrain features from above, learned to calculate drift caused by crosswinds, and practiced estimating distances and times. Mathematics became more than abstract numbers. It meant the difference between finding your aerodrome after a mission or running out of fuel over enemy territory. The weapons training during ground school was equally intensive. Students learned the mechanics of machine guns, how to clear jams at 10,000 feet while flying, and the ballistics of firing from a moving platform at another moving target. They studied enemy aircraft recognition, memorizing the silhouettes of German Fokkers, Albatros fighters, and observation planes. In the heat of combat, Split-second identification could mean life or death. You needed to know friend from foe instantly, without hesitation. Perhaps most importantly, ground school introduced the mental framework of aerial combat. Instructors, many of whom had volunteered with French or British squadrons before America entered the war, shared hard-won lessons from the Western Front. They taught energy management in dogfights, the importance of altitude and speed, the deadly danger of losing situational awareness, and the tactics that kept pilots alive. Students learned about the Immelman turn, the split S, barrel rolls, and other maneuvers that would become instinctive in combat. The attrition rate during ground school was significant. Many candidates discovered that the theoretical knowledge required was beyond them, or that their aptitude for the technical aspects of aviation was insufficient. Others failed physical fitness standards or couldn't handle the mental pressure. Those who graduated ground school received their first taste of victory, but they knew the hardest challenges still lay ahead. From ground school, the successful candidates moved to primary flight training. This is where theory met reality, where young men who had only imagined flight would finally leave the earth. The primary training fields were scattered across the United States, with major facilities in Texas, California, Ohio, and other states with suitable flying weather. The aircraft used for initial instruction were typically Curtiss JN-4 trainers, affectionately known as Jennies. These were relatively stable, forgiving biplanes, perfect for teaching the basics, but worlds away from the high-performance fighters the students would eventually fly in combat. The first flight was an experience none of these young men ever forgot. Climbing into the open cockpit, feeling the wind, smelling the castor oil that lubricated the rotary engines, hearing the engine roar to life, and then that magical moment when the wheels left the ground and they were airborne. For many, it was the realization of a dream they had harbored since childhood. For others, it was terrifying. The instructors were experienced pilots, often barnstormers or civilian aviators who had been pressed into military service. They sat in the front cockpit, the student behind them, communicating through hand signals and a primitive speaking tube. Learning to fly in 1917 was nothing like modern flight instruction. There were no radios, no sophisticated instruments, no simulators to practice and safely. You learned by doing, and you learned fast. The first lessons focused on basic aircraft control. Students learned how the stick and rudder pedals affected the aircraft's attitude, how to maintain level flight, how to climb and descend smoothly. The aircraft of that era were inherently unstable, requiring constant input from the pilot. There was no autopilot, no trim tabs to reduce control pressure. Flying demanded every bit of your attention, every second you were in the air. Takeoffs and landings were the most dangerous phases of flight, just as they are today, but the danger was magnified by the primitive aircraft and minimal training. Students practiced touch-and-go landings endlessly, learning to judge altitude and airspeed by feel and sight. The aircraft had no airspeed indicators in many cases, no altimeters beyond basic aneroid barometers. Pilots learned to judge their speed by the sound of the wind in the wires, the feel of the controls, and the visual reference of the ground passing below. Stalls and spins were mortal enemies of the novice pilot. Aircraft of that era could enter a spin with little warning, and recovery required precise, counterintuitive control inputs. Many student pilots died in flat spins, their aircraft corkscrewing into the ground, while they frantically fought controls that seemed to have a mind of their own. Instructors taught spin recovery religiously, drilling the procedures until they became automatic. Even so, training accidents were common. Aviation was a deadly business, and learning to fly meant accepting that every flight could be your last. As students progressed through primary training, they moved on to more advanced maneuvers. Steep turns taught them to manage bank angle and back pressure simultaneously. Chandelles and Lazy Eights developed their feel for the aircraft during constantly changing flight regimes. Emergency procedures were practiced again and again because engines were unreliable, and forced landings were a regular occurrence. Students learned to scan constantly for suitable fields, to judge wind direction from smoke or vegetation, and to execute an approach and landing without power. Cross-country navigation flights tested everything they had learned. Students would be sent to fly to a distant field and return, relying solely on map reading and compass headings. Getting lost was a rite of passage, and many young pilots experienced the gut-wrenching fear of not knowing where they were, fuel running low, and unfamiliar terrain stretching in every direction. Those who made it back learned valuable lessons about planning, adaptability, and keeping their composure under stress. Formation flying was introduced during primary training as well. Combat flying was rarely done solo. Pilots needed to fly in tight formations, maintaining position while scanning for enemies, navigating, and monitoring their aircraft systems. The concentration required was immense. A moment's inattention could result in a mid-air collision. Students learned the standard formations, the hand signals for formation changes, and how to maintain visual contact with their flight leader while still watching for threats. Night flying added another layer of complexity and danger. With minimal lighting, no navigation aids, and aircraft that were challenging enough to fly in daylight, night operations claimed many lives. But combat missions didn't stop when the sun went down, so pilots needed to be comfortable flying in darkness. They learned to trust their instruments, such as they were, to develop a sense for the aircraft's attitude when visual references disappeared, and to land using nothing more than a few kerosene flares marking the field boundary. After approximately 2 months of primary training, those who hadn't washed out or been killed in accidents moved on to advanced flight training. This is where the real fighter pilot skills were developed. Advanced training often took place at specialized schools, and many American pilots were sent to Europe for this phase, training alongside French and British instructors who had actual combat experience. The aircraft changed too. Instead of docile Jennies, students now flew more responsive, more powerful aircraft that behaved more like the fighters they would soon take into battle. Aerobatic training became the focus of advanced instruction. Every maneuver that would be used in combat was practiced until it was second nature. Loops, rolls, Immelman turns, split-S maneuvers, half-loops, hammerhead stalls, and countless other maneuvers were drilled relentlessly. But these weren't just aerial gymnastics for show. Each maneuver had a tactical purpose. The loop could be used to reverse direction quickly and gain altitude. The Immelman turn allowed a pilot to convert speed into altitude while changing direction. The split-S was an emergency dive maneuver to evade an attacker. Every aerobatic maneuver was a tool in the fighter pilot's survival kit. Gunnery training intensified during the advanced phase. Students practiced air-to-air gunnery against towed targets, learning the complex skill of deflection shooting. Hitting a target moving in 3 dimensions while you yourself are moving in 3 dimensions, both aircraft subject to wind and constantly changing positions, is one of the most difficult skills in warfare. Students learn to lead their targets, to estimate range without instruments, and to fire short, accurate bursts rather than spraying ammunition wildly. Mock dogfights, called hassles, taught students the reality of aerial combat. 2 aircraft would square off, each trying to gain an advantage over the other. The instructors taught the fundamental rules of air combat. Altitude is life. Speed is life insurance. He who sees first has the advantage. Never turn your back on an enemy. Never follow an enemy down in a dive. Always check your 6. These weren't just catchy phrases. They were lessons written in the blood of pilots who had learned them too late. Students learned energy management, the art of trading altitude for speed and speed for altitude, always maintaining enough of both to stay in the fight. They learned deflection shooting, how to put your aircraft and your guns in position where your bullets would intersect the enemy's flight path. They learned situational awareness, constantly scanning the sky, keeping track of friendly and enemy positions, watching for the glint of sun on wings that might betray an enemy diving from above. The training was realistic and dangerous. Mock combat sometimes resulted in actual collisions. Aggressive maneuvering led to overstressed airframes and structural failures. Pilots pushing their limits sometimes exceeded them, entering unrecoverable spins or overstressing their aircraft until wings folded or control surfaces failed. The cemeteries near training fields grew with each class of students. But those who survived emerged as competent fighter pilots, ready for the ultimate test. The final phase of training involved tactical instruction. Pilots learned to operate as part of a squadron, coordinating attacks, covering each other, and executing complex patrol and attack missions. They studied the latest intelligence from the front, learning about enemy tactics, new aircraft types, and the evolving nature of aerial warfare. They were taught about trench layouts, how to identify targets on the ground, and how to support infantry operations. By the end of 6 months, the transformation was complete. Young men who had never flown, who in many cases had never even seen an airplane, were now fighter pilots. They could fly in any weather, day or night. They could navigate across unfamiliar territory. They could dogfight, shoot accurately, and work as part of a coordinated team. They understood their aircraft intimately, could perform field repairs, and knew how to coax maximum performance from their machines. They were ready for war. The numbers are staggering. Between 1917 and 1918, the United States trained approximately 8,000 pilots. Hundreds of them died in training accidents. The training program consumed vast resources, required thousands of instructors and support personnel, and represented an unprecedented mobilization of American aviation capability. But it worked. American pilots arrived in France and quickly proved themselves against the veteran German airmen. The first American squadrons to see combat were filled with graduates of this accelerated training program. The 94th Aero Squadron, the famous hat-in-the-ring squadron, became operational in early 1918. The 27th Aero Squadron, the 95th, the 103rd, and many others followed. These young American pilots, many still in their late teens or early 20s, threw themselves into combat with a courage and determination that amazed their French and British allies. Eddie Rickenbacker, America's ace of aces with 26 confirmed victories, was a product of this training system. Frank Luke, the Arizona balloon buster, learned to fly in this program before becoming the first American aviator to receive the Medal of Honor. Raoul Lufbery, though he had prior combat experience with the Lafayette Escadrille, helped train many of these new pilots and passed on his hard-won knowledge. The tactics developed during this training period influenced American air combat doctrine for decades. The emphasis on aggressive offense, the importance of teamwork and mutual support, the focus on marksmanship and aircraft handling skills, all became hallmarks of American fighter aviation. The organizational structures, the squadron systems, the ranking and promotion criteria, much of this was established during this frantic period of expansion and training. The legacy of this training program extends far beyond World War I. Many of the pilots trained in 1917 and 1918 went on to become the senior leadership of the U.S. Army Air Corps in the 1930s and the Army Air Forces in World War II. Generals like Karl Spatz, Ira Eaker, and others who commanded massive air forces in the Second World War got their start in this program. The institutional knowledge, the understanding of what it took to train fighter pilots effectively, was preserved and refined. The 6-month timeline seems almost impossible by modern standards, where fighter pilot training can take several years. But the circumstances were different. The aircraft were simpler, with fewer systems to master. The tactics, while sophisticated, were less complex than modern beyond visual range combat. And perhaps most significantly, the tolerance for risk was much higher. Training accidents that would ground an entire program today were accepted as the cost of rapid mobilization. It's worth reflecting on what these young men accomplished. They volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs imaginable. Aviation was still in its infancy. Aircraft were unreliable, fragile, and unforgiving. Safety equipment was minimal. Parachutes weren't standard issue for most of the war. If your aircraft caught fire, and they often did because of the fuel tanks positioned directly in front of the pilot, you had two choices: ride it down and burn or jump and fall. Many chose to jump. The physical demands were intense. Flying in an open cockpit at altitude meant exposure to temperatures well below freezing. Frostbite was common. The noise was deafening, often causing permanent hearing damage. The vibration from the engines was constant and exhausting. Combat missions could last hours, requiring intense concentration the entire time because a moment's lapse could be fatal. The psychological stress was equally severe. These pilots faced death every time they flew, whether in training or combat. They watched friends and comrades die in training accidents, mid-air collisions, and mechanical failures. They knew that their life expectancy once they reached the front was measured in weeks. New pilots arriving at frontline squadrons were often dead within days, shot down by experienced German aces before they learned the harsh realities of combat. Yet they persevered. They learned. They fought. And they won. By the time of the armistice in November 1918, American pilots had achieved air superiority over sections of the Western Front. They had shot down hundreds of German aircraft. They had protected American ground forces, conducted reconnaissance missions, bombed enemy positions, and proven that American aviation could stand shoulder to shoulder with the best in the world. The training facilities established during this period formed the foundation of American military aviation training for years to come. Fields in Texas that trained World War I pilots were still training pilots in World War II and beyond. The systems developed for selecting candidates, the curriculum design, the progression from basic to advanced training, much of this became standard practice. The human stories are equally compelling. Farm boys who had never traveled beyond their county became international warriors. College students put their futures on hold to serve their country. Mechanics and engineers applied their technical knowledge in entirely new ways. All of them were united by the shared experience of learning to fly, the camaraderie of the training fields, and the bond formed by facing danger together. The instructors deserve recognition too. Many were civilian pilots who joined the military training program out of patriotism. Others were early military aviators who had learned to fly in the years before the war. Some were foreign volunteers, French and British pilots temporarily assigned to help train Americans. They worked long hours, took enormous risks demonstrating maneuvers, and carried the weight of knowing that their teaching would determine whether their students lived or died in combat. The ground crews, the mechanics, the armament specialists, the countless support personnel who kept the training program running also played vital roles. They maintained aircraft that required constant attention, repaired damage from training accidents, kept engines running, and ensured that students had serviceable aircraft to fly. Their work was less glamorous than flying, but absolutely essential. The technological progress during this period was remarkable. At the beginning of American involvement in the war, the military was flying aircraft that were barely more advanced than the Wright brothers' original design. By the end of the war, they were operating high-performance fighters with synchronized machine guns, advanced engines, and sophisticated control systems. The rate of innovation was breathtaking, and pilots and ground crews had to constantly adapt to new equipment and new capabilities. The strategic importance of this training program cannot be overstated. Without pilots, America's industrial might in aircraft production would have been meaningless. The country could build thousands of aircraft, but without trained pilots to fly them, they were just expensive sculptures. The training program was the bottleneck, and the success of American air power depended entirely on training enough pilots fast enough. Looking back from our modern perspective, the accomplishment seems even more impressive. In an era before sophisticated simulators, before computer-based training, before many of the safety systems we consider essential, these training programs produced competent fighter pilots in just 6 months. The human cost was high, but the results were undeniable. The lessons learned during this period influenced aviation training worldwide. The structure of military flight training programs today, with their progression from basic to advanced phases, their emphasis on both theoretical knowledge and practical skills, their focus on safety while still maintaining realistic training, all trace their lineage back to the programs established in 1917 and 1918. In closing, the story of training America's first fighter pilots is a testament to American innovation, determination, and courage. Faced with an enormous challenge and a tight deadline, the military and civilian aviation community came together to create a training system that worked. It wasn't perfect. Lives were lost. Mistakes were made. But ultimately, it succeeded in its primary mission, producing fighter pilots capable of competing with the best in the world. These young men, who arrived at training fields across America as raw recruits, emerged 6 months later as skilled aviators ready to take the fight to the enemy. They represented the best of their generation, volunteers who chose one of the most dangerous paths available in service of their country. Their legacy lives on in every American fighter pilot who has followed, in the training systems they helped establish, and in the traditions of courage and excellence they exemplified. From ground school to dogfighting in just 6 months, they accomplished what seemed impossible, and in doing so, helped write one of the most remarkable chapters in American military aviation history.